everyone. Welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. It's already been almost a month since South Korea's new foreign minister, Cho Tae-yul, took office. During that time, he has held phone talks with U.S. and Japanese counterparts and many others, but not Wang Yi, his Chinese counterpart. Wang Yi did send a congratulatory message to Cho, but experts say having no phone call is unusual. Many say this shows the strained relationship between Seoul and Beijing, and this is also having a ripple effect over people-to-people exchanges as well. How do experts diagnose the current relationship between South Korea and China, and how should the ties be managed? For this, we invite Professor Ban Kil-joo from the Ilmin International Relations Institute of Korea University. Welcome to the show, Professor Ban.
Good evening. Good to be here.
And we also have Evans Revere, a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. Mr. Revere was also the former acting assistant secretary of state. Good to have you with us again, Mr. Revere.
Great to be with you.
All right, first question to our Mr. Revere. It has been more than 3 weeks since South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yul took office. But reportedly, as I said before, he has not yet held phone talks with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. Is this usual?
I think it's quite unusual for the foreign ministers of two important neighboring countries, two countries that are obviously major trading partners, and two countries that have a shared interest in maintaining peace and stability on and around the Korean Peninsula. It's unusual that they have not been in direct contact yet, these two foreign ministers. It's especially unusual, in my view, since Foreign Minister Cho made such a point of stressing his desire to place a high priority on improving relations between the Republic of Korea and the PRC very early on in his tenure. This tells me that Beijing is currently focused on some other priorities right now. I think the number one priority for Beijing right now is to stop the very dangerous downturn in relations with the United States, and obviously the fact that there have been some important meetings between the U.S. National Security Advisor and Wang Yi. Liu Jianchao, an important figure in the Chinese Communist Party, has also recently visited Washington, and I think those are efforts that China is making to try to at least stop the downturn in bilateral relations between Washington and Beijing. I think the other priority for Beijing right now is reaching out to its North Korean ally to try to better understand and manage North Korea's emerging partnership with Russia. And of course, recently we saw the Chinese vice foreign minister in Pyongyang immediately after the return of the North Korean foreign minister from Moscow. So I think those are the two things that Beijing is focusing on right now.
All right, Beijing has different focus right now. And it's actually quite not surprising because Seoul and Beijing did not have much interaction last year. Professor Ban, in fact, during the New Year reception where Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed diplomatic envoys in China, he reportedly did not mention South Korea at all. Now, how might China be seeing South Korea based on last year's low level of communication?
Well, since it is a tricky question, we need to take a look at what has happened so far and what seems to be happening in the near future. Last year, the two actors between Washington and Beijing were indeed more interactive than the two actors between Seoul and Beijing. For example, there was a bilateral summit between the United States and China in San Francisco last year. However, I don't think communication between South Korea and China also remained extremely low last year. Well, both countries showed enthusiasm for improving the relationship. In September 2023, South Korea's Prime Minister Han Duck-soo visited China for the Hangzhou Asian Games and had a meeting with China's President Xi Jinping. In this opportunity, they discussed many agendas, including the ROC-China relationship, economic cooperation, and cultural communication. In November 2023, Chinese Minister Wang Yi visited Busan city of South Korea and met South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin. In this ministerial meeting, both countries reconfirmed the status of their relationship, which is a strategic cooperative partnership. When these diplomatic efforts made last year are taken into consideration, I will say that Beijing is likely continue this line of effort in 2024 as well, while seeing South Korea as an actor for cooperation in the region. The exclusion of South Korea from Wang Yi hosted New Year reception seems to be designed to put South Korea under pressure for more efforts to improve relations with China rather than worsening the bilateral relationship. Despite the fact, there seems several obstacles to improving the relationship between South Korea and China. The first obstacle would be a different perspective on the Taiwan issue. South Korea sends a message that the Taiwan issue is not separated from security on the Korean Peninsula. By contrast, China believes that South Korea's position like this one is against a one China policy. The second obstacle is based on a different perspective of how to tackle North Korea's nuclear program. South Korea stresses that North Korea should be denuclearized. Likewise, Seoul believes that sanctions against North Korea should continue to be made, and a high level of deterrent power should be built to do that. In contrast, China tends to side with North Korea while saying that the reason for Pyongyang to develop nuclear weapons is that United States pose a threat to North Korean regime. The third obstacle would be a different perspective on international order. South Korea, along with other liberal democracies, is eager to preserve a liberal international order, which has been maintained ever since the end of World War II. By contrast, China believes that this system is the United States-led hegemonic order and should be revised while cooperating with other revisionist states such as Russia. All the above obstacles are related to the new colder mechanism in international politics. That explains why Seoul attempts to mitigate the new colder mechanism while proposing the principle of inclusiveness. Since South Korea is trying its best to make the trilateral summit between South Korea, Japan, and China happen this year, the relationship between South Korea and China is also likely to step forward this year, I believe.
Right, I see. So based on what our Professor Ban told us, there was a certain level of communication last year, and it is expected to improve. But Mr. Revere, it seems China has been having much more active talks with Japan ever since Xi Jinping and Kishida's summit in November last year. Do you also see the difference in how China is treating Japan compared to South Korea?
I think it's fair to say that Beijing seems to be placing a higher priority on reaching out to Japan. The Chinese are concerned about the growing strength of U.S.-Japan ROK cooperation, and this is troubling for Beijing. I think the Chinese may see an opportunity to use this outreach to Tokyo and also to use the opportunity presented by what it probably sees as a politically weak Japanese prime minister to try to influence the rapid development of this trilateral relationship. So yes, I think it's fair to say that Beijing seems to be more focused on Japan than it is on the ROK right now. So I would make that the third of the priorities. The first two I mentioned earlier in my response, and so this is priority number 3 for Beijing, at least right now.
Right, I see your point, Mr. Revere. Now, Professor Ban, not just diplomatically, South Korea is economically losing its power in China as well. Seoul's share in China's imported goods market dropped by 6%, hitting a 30-year low. Why is this?
As you pointed out, it seems true that the status of China as South Korea's economic partner has been weaker than before. To be more precise, I would like to say that South Korea is gaining more ground in the United States economically rather than losing its power in China. What does that mean? These days, the United States seems more important to South Korea than China, not only militarily, but also economically. As you all know, the United States is ranked the #1 export for South Korea for the first time in the last 2 decades, while overtaking China. Why is this happening? Well, we are living in the world in an era of economic security. In this sense, I would say that South Korea's transformative diplomacy might not be separated from the change of the biggest exporter from China to the United States. Likewise, global posture might have some impacts on this figure in the sense that redesigning the global supply chain is on the way. However, these two policy changes are not significant reason why South Korea's economic power has weakened in China. Similar to the United States, last year, the United States lost China as its top exporter for the first time since 2006. We need to see other factors further change in this economic landscape. To be honest, China does not serve as a charming or promising market any longer. As we are well aware, China's growth is much slower than expected. China's economic growth is not the 2 digits anymore. In 2023, China's GDP grew only 5.2%. The peak China discourse is gaining attention these days. Likewise, unemployment in China remains high and the cost of labor is also high. So China is not a profitable market for South Korea's intermediary goods any longer. China also attempts to establish its own infrastructure for intermediary goods. In short, I would say that South Korea is not losing its power in China, but rather China is losing its ground as the most fast-growing economic power due to its domestic stagnation.
All right, I see your point, Professor Ban. Now, Mr. Revere, coming back to diplomacy, our Professor Ban already told us that cross-strait issues is one of the obstacles that South Korea and China needs to overcome. But in fact, these cross-strait issues are actually closely related to U.S.-China ties. And for now, the two superpowers are trying to maintain their relationship, with Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi holding a meeting in Thailand recently. But how are they viewing the status quo, in your opinion?
Well, I think the United States and the PRC have made some important progress in reaching out to each other, stabilizing relations, obviously stopping the free fall that we were seeing in relations last year and the year before. So things have stabilized, things have improved between Washington and Beijing. The dialogue channels are open. The United States has been very careful in its public rhetoric to avoid any references to Taiwan independence or support for Taiwan independence. So there's a bit of good news in terms of bilateral ties at this point, but let's not kid ourselves. There are some very serious differences between Beijing and Washington on a range of issues, including issues related to the Korean Peninsula. As well as different perspectives on other crisis points around the world, including in the Middle East. So there are still some serious problems out there, and I think both Washington and Beijing realize that.
All right, I see. So still, there are lingering issues, but for now, bilateral ties seems quite improved right now. But Professor Ban, if Trump returns to the White House, many expect China-U.S. ties to worsen, as Trump is reportedly already planning to impose a tariff of 60% on Chinese-made products. How do you forecast Trump's action against China to be?
To be honest, it is true that there are huge differences in policies between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. The Biden administration has changed most policies that the Trump administration made, including policies on allies, climate change, and North Korea. However, there's one thing that both administrations remain coherent. Not surprisingly, that is about how to deal with China. The Biden administration has inherited the Indo-Pacific policy of the Trump administration, which aimed at upsetting China's rise as a revisionist in the world. Furthermore, in February 2022, the Biden administration laid out the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States while evolving Trump's policy in more detail. In this sense, if Trump returns to the White House, his action is not going to be significantly different from Biden's, at least regarding China policy. His verbal messages might be more intense and vociferous while targeting the domestic audience rather than China to show that he is a strong leader, unlike Biden. In short, the United States strategy and policy to counter China is likely to remain coherent. The fact that Trump said that he could impose a tariff of more than 60% on Chinese products can be simply understood by the negotiation strategy that he might take just in case he returns to the White House.
All right, I see. Now, though our Professor Ban said the policy would be not that different from current Biden administration, Mr. Revere, if Trump comes back and if they show different views over this Taiwan Strait issue, would Seoul be in any way urged to rethink its stance regarding Taiwan? And in that case, how should it be?
I think the Republic of Korea has been very clear about the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And that view of South Korea has been very warmly welcomed by Washington policymakers. The fact that South Korea has recognized that in the overall context of developments in the Indo-Pacific region, peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits is an important factor. And as I said, that's warmly welcomed in Washington. But I think Washington also appreciates how delicate the Taiwan issue is for South Korea. I don't foresee any likelihood that Washington is going to squeeze or press the ROK to do more than what the ROK has already done. But I would also add that continuing statements from Seoul about the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and a continued focus by South Korea on overall peace and stability in East and Northeast Asia will be important and will continue to be welcomed by Washington.
All right, I see. Well, Mr. Revere, this just popped out in my head. If there is an issue regarding cross-strait relations, some reports say that this is going to eventually lead to some of the real crisis in Korean Peninsula as well regarding North Korea. Is there any connection between the two?
I'm not so sure that there is a connection, although I think there's a tactical and strategic interest that China has in pressing the United States and pressing America's partners in East Asia on a number of different fronts. So that would include, of course, the Korean Peninsula, and that would include, of course, Taiwan. But I think it's important to remember, we were talking about the Trump administration and the possibility of a Trump return to the White House. It was Donald Trump, as president of the United States, who once was asked a question about Taiwan policy. And he actually said publicly that if he decides to make any changes in U.S. Taiwan policy, he would first discuss them with Xi Jinping, which I found to be an astonishing statement from the United States president. So let's not automatically assume that when it comes to Taiwan, that Donald Trump is inclined to be confrontational with Xi Jinping. On the trade front, perhaps, but not necessarily on Taiwan. And in discussions with many of my friends in Taiwan, Donald Trump certainly makes the people of Taiwan very nervous about what he might do regarding overall policy towards the island.
All right, I see your point, Mr. Revere. Now, before I wrap up this show, I'd like to ask this question. Professor Ban, how should South Korea manage ties with China overall?
Well, Seoul needs to deal with the relationship between South Korea and China from a comprehensive perspective based upon its evolution of diplomatic strategy, simply beyond the bilateral relationship between the two. To make its diplomacy continue to be dynamic, not static, South Korea's diplomacy should be evolved into 3 steps: security diplomacy, inclusive diplomacy, and then expanded diplomacy. I think security diplomacy as the first step turned out to be a great success in the sense that ROK-US alliance is the strongest in history, and the new trilateral security partnership becomes visualized. So in 2024, the South Korean government needs to pay more attention to inclusive diplomacy as the second step of its diplomatic evolution. Inclusive diplomacy is based upon the idea that South Korea puts more emphasis on its relationship with non-like-minded countries such as China. As you know, the Yoon administration highlighted the principle of inclusiveness when it laid out its own Indo-Pacific strategy in December 2022. The year 2024 is right about time to show the world how this principle of inclusiveness is applied to the real diplomacy. Finally, in late 2024 or 2025, the South Korean government needs to evolve its diplomatic strategy to the third step, which is expanded diplomacy. In this step, South Korea should turn its eyes to non-pivotal areas, including Central Asia. To make this journey continue to go on, South Korea basically should pay more attention to the areas that have been of little interest so far. International, how to manage China across the board should be reviewed in this line of effort rather than short-sighted or tactically driven bilateral relationships.
All right, I see. So South Korea needs to take comprehensive and inclusive approach regarding China. All right, well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Ban and Mr. Revere, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.